Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Andres. I'm with a company called Global Health Strategies, and we, as the name suggests, work on communications and advocacy in function of public health. Thank you so much for joining us on a discussion on how multilateralism can deliver for the Sustainable Development Goals, especially related to topics like health, climate change, and sustainable finance development, and of course, gender equality, because as we know, all these issues affect and impact women much more. So, significant progress has been made across major development indicators, but over 50% of the world's population is still left behind. Only 12% of the SDG targets are on track, and progress on over half of these targets is either insufficient or regressing, especially in critical areas like poverty, hunger, and halting climate change. At the same time, we find ourselves at an interesting time in history when the Global South is leading on many of these global platforms that have the ability to impact these issues. South Africa is BRICS president. Indonesia in 2022 was the head of the G20. Then we had India, of course, last year. We have Brazil this year. And we have South Africa next year before the G20 presidency goes to the United States. So this presents a unique opportunity to set the agenda and make sure that these global platforms deliver for the Global South. So that is what we'll be discussing today. It's a roundtable, which means that I will hand over to this fantastic panel that I have over here. I will ask them each one question to sort of set the scene for the discussion, and then we'll move into a very interactive part of the discussion in which I invite you all to participate. It's kind of like a Q&A on steroids is what I talked to the panelists about before. So we invite you all to reflect on the panelists' comments. We invite you to reflect on the topic. We invite you to ask questions to the panelists, but also to yourselves. Please feel free to raise your hand, jump in, and share your thoughts, reflections, and experience. So with that, we will go to Luciana Servo, who is the president of IPEA, the Institute of Applied Economic Research in Brazil, where she works on studies related to health policy. So, Luciana, continuing on from Indonesia and India's G20 presidencies, could you please share your perspective on how Brazil can drive initiatives for sustainable finance for the SDGs, keeping in mind the needs of the Global South?
Thank you, Sarah, and also thank you for RF and the Capital Conversations organizations for the invitation to be part of this panel. I would like to stress something that was said today in different moments, that we are in a unique moment, a unique opportunity. Besides this fact that we have Global South countries leading important institutions like BRICS, like G20, like IBSA, we also have an opportunity in Brazil in itself. Now, we have a president. President Lula is known as a global leader. He's also someone that understands multilateralism and its importance, and he's reinforcing the importance of rethinking the multilateral system, rethinking the multilateral banks for the agenda of development with an inclusive and sustainable development. This means a lot because, in fact, if you see, as Dr. Isabella Teixeira said this morning, we have a lot of advances in our countries. Some of them have a lot of setbacks, like Brazil. Then we see things that we think that were going up, going down again, and having a lot of setbacks. One of the things that we are putting again on the agenda that we think that we have not overcome in some sense is poverty and hunger. So to bring this back to the agenda 6 years later in Brazil and seeing these problems growing up in other underdeveloped countries makes us think that something is not going right. We cannot ask about SDG in terms of sustainability more than environmental crisis in itself, but sustaining our advances. If you cannot sustain our advances, we are going to put more money to go back to 6, 10, 11 years before, and then having to be back to the same place that we were when we were in the 2015 in Brazil. In the case when we look at our mortality, maternal mortality, hunger and poverty, we look in our environmental crisis in some sense, we look at other indicators in SDGs, we have a huge crisis. We will not achieve the SDGs with the same model, with the same process that we have done since the 2015. So it's our agenda. It's important for us as Brazilians. It's important for us as the Troika. It's important for us as underdeveloped and global South countries to think collectively about how to sustain a new development agenda from now on. How to put the UN system as the center of the multilateralism, but with a reform that brings back ideals that were part of the process in the beginning. And one of the things that we have to think about in terms of multilateralism, and this is being said by Brazilians and other countries, is that we cannot say who put more money has more votes. We have to do a common agenda when people that are being affected by the problems, the social problems, the crisis, the economic crisis, can have a voice and a say in the same way that the ones that are putting the money. So one of the important things is that we have to think the reform of the multilateral banks as an equal vote system. We have to bring this to the agenda. As was said by our Egyptian friend here, we don't have to put the ones who are giving the money to do the reform. We have to do the reform as equal parts. So we have to, of course, have the North and the banks as important parts, because if you put a proposal that they are not a part of the proposal, they will not accept it. But also you have to sit on the table. You have to have a say and a voice on this table. So that cannot be a model where the reform comes up, down. It has to be a horizontal process of reform. Besides that, I think we have a responsibility as the Global South now. We have to deliver, again, as Dr. Isabella said, we have a responsibility of not committing the same mistakes. We have to be implementation focused. We have to see recommendations and process that what do we want from this process? What do we want from G20 and G20 in Brazil? What do we want from BRICS and IBSA in a process that will not be the same doing of giving the same responses that were not working in the past. So we have to think about pooling resources, and pooling resources doesn't mean necessarily blended finance. Blended finance is important, but states and nations has to be part of this process. Governments has to be part of this process. To pool resources, we have to have common goals. So we have to sit on a table and see which are the common goals. In Brazil, President Lula is saying we have to fight hunger, poverty, and inequality as a common goal. We also have to have a climate action that makes difference. These are two task forces, special task force for Brazil. And although they are the same old problems, they have to have new solutions. And pooling resources in the sense that we go to the north to ask for resources, but we also have to think about how the Global South is pooling resources for these problems. How we are going to engage in a process that our common problems are treated commonly by our resources, our national and our ODA resources. Knowledge sharing, this is what T20 does best. How we are going to share our knowledge, our best practices, the way we are dealing with our problems so that the common solutions can be brought to the table. Besides that, mutual capacity building. I was saying, someone was in another table said Bangladesh is having some great solutions for digital transfer for society, for equitable access to technologies. And Brazil is also doing a process, and all the countries here are talking about digital inclusive transformation. So let's work together with the G20, T20, and IBSA to bring this best practice, this solution to this. and then bring population to the center of the discussion. We have to have participation, social participation. It cannot be a technocratic process. This is another thing that is being discussed in Brazil. I think it's important for us to let the population know what they want to bring to the table, and also build capacity with them, build capacity with civil society. So I think these are some things that are quite important for us right now. I think it's not only for us. I've been seeing this in the international debate about how these international relations, but participation in a sense of horizontality, capacity building, and then bringing the global topics that are common agendas for the debate and pooling resources for that.
Thank you so much. So I heard you say that we need our global leaders to find a new model, work on common agendas where we are equal partners. And that brings me to Rachel. This is Rachel Toka-Apia. She is a director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Rachel, and I was wondering, in your opinion, how should funders work with governments and global and regional groups to really accompany aligned policy priority and develop actionable strategies?
Great. No, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be on this panel. It's really an opportune time, first of all, to be having this discussion around the SDGs. As Sarah shared earlier, we're on track to meet just a small proportion, and in fact, in many cases, we're seeing a reversal. I think for me, one word to use is collaboration. Also building on what Luciana shared, the fact that we need to work together. We need to make sure that as donors, we are not trying to devise solutions for others, but those that are actually impacted, those that are on the ground, have a seat at the table. And so with this in regard, we are talking about making sure that, yes, we've got global North actors, we've also got global South countries having an equal voice. And just to give you a visual representation of why it is so critical for us to collaborate, I want to use the imagery of building a house, right? You've got to do the foundation, the brickwork, you've got windows, you've got doors, you've got the roofing. And if you imagine where all the parties that are involved, whether it's the masons, it's the carpenters, the roofing experts, don't come together to actually plan, to have a timeline. At what stage do we need to bring in this group, this skill set? What budget do we need? You could have those that are organizing, laying the roof, arrive shortly after the foundation has been set, or those that are putting in place the door frames and the windows. And the results of that is that you're going to lose time, you're going to waste resources. But when it comes to the SDGs, we're talking about human development, human lives. And so it's not just about the loss in frustration and in, money, but we're actually talking about losing more lives than that we could avoid losing because we're not collaborating. And then when I look at these particular groupings, whether it's the G20, ASEAN, BRICS, the nature of these groupings is actually in sync with the broader objectives of the SDGs and what they seek to achieve. And so engaging with them is a priority. I think why reinvent the wheel when there are existing groupings that you can work with? ASEAN, for instance, has a political security community, economic community, social cultural community. The G20, too, as we have seen, has assumed a critical role for global South nations as the presidencies have moved from Indonesia to India, Brazil, soon South Africa. And now we've got the G20 that has been, the AU having been added to the G20. And I'm hoping at some point I'll hear G21. But just to acknowledge that we have this unique time in history with the emerging economies holding the presidencies. And when we collaborate and really keep an agenda on the table for a while, you see the power, you start to see the impact that it can have. earlier this morning when we had the India T20 handover to the Brazil T20, I think it wasn't lost on many of us that women-led development has been one of the India G20's top agenda items. And so for me to see very visually this handover to a group of powerful women that are leading the T20, the three institutions, just shows the power of what you can achieve when you put something on the agenda, you work together, and you do this consistently over a period of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So we've spoken a little bit about the guiding principles, the how, and I want to hand over to Jacqueline right now to speak a little bit about the what. So Jacqueline Kitulu is the chairperson of Rocket Health in Kenya, which is a digital platform that aims to increase access to quality healthcare services. So, Jacqueline, one important outcome of the G20's declaration is the One Health approach, which includes increasing access to life-saving medicines and technology as an important foundation of emergency preparedness. So, given your expertise on the board of Rocket Health, could you comment on which actions you would like to see at the global level to advance Africa's and the world digital health and digital public infrastructure?
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah, and really a pleasure to sit on this panel with all these wonderful ladies and gentlemen. We were discussing earlier that, is he here by design or is it, by default? But anyway, he said he's enjoying being on the other side of this. So going back to the issue of digital health technologies, I think that's going to be one of the most potent ways of transforming healthcare and looking at SDG 3 in terms of improving health and lives of people. And really, there are so many ways in which we can leverage on that digital technology. And I think best practices at national level being translated into the regional levels, and then, of course, within the various blocs are ways of, again, that same word, I think, which everyone has said, knowledge sharing and building up from there. So from the digital technologies, there's so much. You asked, you said my question was on the what and what that digital technology can do. And number one, it's improving access to healthcare. And I think this morning, the former finance minister, Mr. Mboweni, was also talking about the importance of that health. And everybody has been, we're always struggling. How do we increase access? And digital health technology is so crucial in that. And we are looking at telemedicine, mobile health apps. All these are bridging gaps in health access, particularly in remote and underserved areas, providing essential medicine and information. Two, we can use that digital technologies to enhance healthcare efficiency. So again, we are going back to electronic health records, data analytics, AI-driven solutions to help streamline healthcare processes. And there I'll even give one particular example of an AI-driven technology being used in lower level clinics, to pick out emergency patients. So one of the top killers of children is pneumonia. And it's easy to recognize with certain AI-driven things that can be picked up, so that even where you don't have the highest levels of medical personnel, using that tool, it's so easy to pick up, this is an emergency child, this one needs to be referred to the next level. We are looking at empowering patients. Again, we're talking about digital health tools that to enable patients to take charge of their lives. I think many of you have watches or things that tell you about your stress level, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and all that. Really, that's self-monitoring health tracking apps, accessing to reliable health information. At the advent of post-COVID, we are looking at how important early disease surveillance of outbreaks is. again, even as I say these things from a national point, remember I'm saying that these are things can be translated within the region. And you're looking at real-time data collection and analysis to aid disease surveillance so that you can have more proactive responses. Because once you have those outbreaks in one region, it immediately translates to it's just the country, it's the neighbors, and soon, just like COVID, we are seeing it globally. I'll go back to capacity building and training, and I think that has also been mentioned by Luciana again. We're looking at digital health technologies facilitating training and capacity building for health professionals, helping them to stay up to date with their medical knowledge and practices and improve health outcomes. We're looking at health education and awareness, again, on online platforms and digital campaigns which raise health issues. And in all this, even when you're looking at regulatory points from the point of the health regulator, again, from a digital health technology point of view, the ability to pick up data on various institutions and the professionals who are in them and what outcomes are coming, all those enable us to make better decisions. And all those are things that, there are some countries that are running so well with those digital health technologies. I must say, India has done quite an immense job on that and shared quite liberally with so many others. And so within, looking at those within the G20 who have used such technologies and, just sharing that knowledge with those who are still, trying to build up their systems. So in the what of digital health technology, I think the sources, the open source interoperable systems are so crucial if we're going to leverage on them to transform SDG 3 and, to actualize it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. You mentioned India, so let us go to Nilanjan Ghosh, who is a director at ORF and Think 20 India Secretariat. Mr. Nilanjan, so we've heard from your colleagues, and I wanted to take a moment to think about the continuity angle. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the significant outcomes G20 presidency, especially about climate change and the environment? And then how do you envision Brazil and South Africa continuing to advance these outcomes, given the national interests?
Thank you, Sarah. My distinguished fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. And I reckon that my inclusion in this panel is more by design to bring about a certain amount of gender diversity. So in any case, there's no doubt that the topic is extremely critical, extremely crucial, given the fact that SDGs mark the cornerstone of global development governance. And as such, India's G20 presidency, if you essentially look at most of the goals, they're all geared towards the SDGs. Now, if we look at the SDGs as also, in fact, the themes that India took up and also got reflected in the Think 20, what we call the Think 20 verticals, it seems that there is certain amount of consonance between the goals as also conflict between them. This is more so because there are certain goals which reflect on the efficiency parameters of development, certain goals which reflect on the distributive justice or equity parameters of development, and some others are environmental and climatic, which are reflective of the sustainability parameters. So this, again, if I go back to what Mohan Munna Singhe, who was a resource economist and one of the, I presume the second or the third Deputy Director General of the IPCC, hypothesized that we are dealing with a problem which apparently shows itself as the irreconcilable trinity of equity, efficiency, and sustainability. Now, given this, what is the solution? Does the solution lie with multilateralism? Does the solution lie with some other forms of institutional mechanism? Now, the other important issue is that we are past 7 years, we are in the midway, but as you rightly mentioned, Sarah, that the achievement is less than proportional, much, much less than proportional. When I talk about multilateralism was, of course, challenged globally even before the pandemic with the emergence of strong leaders propagating nationalistic fervors. This also led to insulating tendencies of some of the major world economies that were once heralded as champions of the cause of free markets and globalization. So, and we saw this deglobalizing and insulating tendencies with the US withdrawal from the TPP, the prolongation of the US-China trade war, former US President Trump's disregard of the climate change crisis, Brexit. On the other hand, we find again, parallelly, development of trade blocs, whether it is in the form of the CPTPP, RCEP, or in fact, talking in terms of, say, the development of the Quad on the other side, which is more of a reflection of how it is going to combat the BRI market imperialistic designs. And we find the I2U2 and very recently the IMIC, which has now emerged from the sidelines of the G20 India leaders meet. Now, while it was also apprehended that the pandemic would lead to further insulation of economies, we find the creation of these blocs. Now, under such circumstances, what role can multilateralism play in promoting the SDGs? And I'll come to your example, climate. Let us take the example of Green Agenda, which gets reflected through the various SDGs, whether we talk of SDG 7, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and their impacts felt across all other SDGs. Now, it is well appreciated that these are global concerns, especially because this is reflective of the global common, that is climate change. Now, global problems with a global common goal demand concerted efforts globally. And multilateralism is definitely the answer to that. Now, at the same time, we need to appreciate the fact that the delineation, the definition of Green Agenda is definitely not identical across the world. Given the differential levels of development of nations, the criticality of the practices, the processes, the existing institutions which govern the entire development conservation dynamics, and that is what we find, in fact, because if we talk about the Green Agenda in the LDC, it is completely different from the Green Agenda from if you talk from the perspective of the global north. Now, the other problem that we find is that the global negotiating platforms, like the COP, have led to a certain form of reductionism in the climate negotiation process. And why I want to be emphatic about this is that it has reduced everything to a temperature-centric paradigm on the basis of a timeline. Net zero by 2050, net zero by 2060, net zero by 2070. Now, the developing and the underdeveloped nations have, of course, talked about history, just transition in this process. But they have yet to introduce the concerns regarding the ecosystem services, which are very fundamental to, especially in the poverty-stricken areas. Now, multilateralism can be helpful when, with an overarching and uniform delineation of the Green Agenda, the developmental needs and nuances of the conservation, development, livelihoods, dynamics of various parts of the developing and the underdeveloped world are acknowledged. Otherwise, it is only going to cater to the needs of the few if we are looking at it only from the lens of the Occident. Now, a lot of this got reflected in the G20 New Delhi Leaders Summit. The Leaders' Declaration as such. Especially in the context of accelerating progress on the SDGs, there is a commitment of taking collective action for effective and timely implementation of the G20 2023 action plan to accelerate progress on the SDGs, including the high-level principles. The important opportunity that essentially unfolded with a double troika of the global south, that is Indonesia, India, Brazil, and then India, Brazil, South Africa taking over successive presidencies, provides more voice to the global south to raise these concerns at one of the highest developmental platforms. Now, BRICS as a global platform of the largest emerging nations have not only been adequately represented in the G20, but from 2023 onwards, the presidencies are vested in three of the most significant nations of the bloc, India, Brazil, and South Africa, or the IBSA. One of the biggest achievements, of course, which has we discussed in the very morning, it came up in many of the deliberations, including that of Ambassador Chinay, that the inclusion of the African Union in the G20, which presumably makes it G21. Now, the G20 as a bloc, therefore, makes a very emphatic and a clear statement in favor of multilateralism playing an important role in the SDGs. And the Leaders' Declaration talks of actions on eliminating hunger, malnutrition, global health, calls for an ambitious replenishment of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, including the fight against hunger, poverty, Now, green development, of course. Now, as far as the Troika is concerned, the Troika of the Global South, South Africa is going to be the last point of the Troika, and therefore it is important that a process is set in place by 2025 so that the Global South concerns are no more discussed but get ingrained in the G20 even after the tenure of the Troika ends. Now, I will ask two big questions here. The one big question is that the annual funding requirement to achieve the SDGs has been estimated as US $4.2 trillion. This is primarily because of the unmet demand for fund over the years. Now, this is going to escalate if it is not met, in fact, in 2023. So can multilateralism play a role here? The G20 Leaders Declaration emphasizes the G20's commitments towards mobilization of these funds from all sources. In fact, if you talk about the SDGs, even if you talk about climate, it talks about innovative instruments. Even if you go through the Think 20 communique, there are talks about instruments like, suppose the SDG credits, SDG bonds. And apart from that, it is not only with this, the other critical element that arises is how do we finance adaptation given the fact that around 85 to 90% of the funding is getting into mitigation. Whereas as far as the Global South needs are concerned, we have a huge demand for adaptation funding. Now the third dimension that comes up is with the loss and damage funding, which clearly is at a loss at this point in time, given the fact that nobody knows how to value loss and damage. Is this going to be on the basis of an annual valuation, or because a loss or a damage is a permanent loss or a permanent damage? Now, given that, are we going to take into consideration the loss in opportunity? Because that happens, I mean, to replenish that or to resuscitate that, to compensate for that, we need another 20 years. For the next 20 years, this compensation has to happen. So who will do that? So in any case, the big question is it up to multilateralism to work for achieving the SDGs? I emphatically would like to state that the nature of certain developmental problems being global, like the global commons of climate change, multilateralism has to play a role. It has to work as an indispensable option. If institutions have failed so far, it is principally because of their operational inefficiencies and not because of the vision or goals. If institutions have failed humanity, then we need more efficient alternate multilateral institutions dumping those that exist.
But we cannot
do away with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have 20. That's okay. Thank you. We have 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure that the audience has the opportunity to ask some questions, share some reflections. So may I ask that as you ask your questions, you start by telling us your name and perhaps a little bit about your background so that we know who's asking the questions, and perhaps if we could keep the interventions and the questions to 1 to 2 minutes, that would be great, so that we can give a couple of people the opportunity to weigh in. Madam.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Latif. I'm the Executive Director and Director of Research of the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies in Egypt. I just wanted to make a small comment related to the Loss and Damage Fund. I've seen the birth of the Loss and Damage Fund framework, empty box, okay, in COP27 last year. And supposedly in COP28 there is going to be attempts to add funds and put criteria, hopefully. But then there is the concern by many groups that attention to loss and damage might cover up for the care for adaptation, which is really more important. So they put a bit of attention there and then not allocate funds for adaptation, which is really badly needed for the survival, especially of many countries in the global south. I'm wondering if you have the same concern. Thank you.
Alba, is the question for Nilanjan? Yes.
I agree with that. See, increasingly I keep on hearing this term resilience, that we need to create resilience. Now, resilience for what? Is resilience through adaptation or resilience through mitigation? Now, every time a donor comes, I hear that they're doing resilience funding. Now, ultimately I find that this is getting into some kind of a green project or whatever, where they can see the ROI, the return on investment. In most cases, what happens is, as far as adaptation is concerned, they can't figure out what is the return on investment because they occur in the form of public goods. So as far as loss and damage is concerned, I agree with that. It's quite a possibility.
Thank you so much. The lady in the back.
Thank you, Carolina Rossini from the Data Sphere Initiative and Boston University. So my question goes to all the panelists, right? We mentioned a couple of times that digital inclusion is important, but having been working in the sector for over 20 years, it's not enough, right? We need to talk about meaningful connectivity, and we also need to talk about which digital world we want. So I would love if you could explore, because even when we talk about digital inclusion for health, there are goods and bads that come from it, right? When we talk from the AI, there are goods and bads that come from that. So going beyond the first step, which is inclusion, what are your recommendations for the work forward in the G20? Thank you.
Over to you, Jacqueline.
All right, thank you very much. And indeed, a very valid point. With the whole digital frontier comes a whole lot of a multiplicity of other challenges, and I think that said, it will continue moving ahead of any regulation or anything else you can do about it. So we have to find ways of accommodating it into what we're going to do. And I think that one of the ways around that is, again, now in terms of the data protection laws, because that's, especially from a health perspective, that's one of the major issues that we struggle with. That, yes, what happens to confidentiality and privacy and all those things that come along with shared data on platforms that, when it was all locked up in one place, well, it was perhaps safe unless someone broke into it, but now you're not sure where it's even stored and what clouds. So basically, I think data protection laws and enhancement of the same. I know in some regions that has been a very strong aspect, not so in some of the global south countries, and I think it's building up on those. I know in Kenya that's a big one, which was, the law was passed a few years back, but it's now actually being actualized, and we're realizing the need so much more. So I think that's one big way to look at it. But then again, as the other ways, the other issue is putting digital technologies and into curricula. Even for the health sector, there's using the technology, but also then embracing it and then aligning it to what we need. And I mean, it doesn't even just have to be health or whatever else. And if you're going to get the benefit from it, again, it goes back to what I was saying, the issues of having it as open source, and having the interoperability between systems, because you're not going to then have something that works here and doesn't work somewhere else. It has to be, if it's going to be a global good or public, it has to serve everybody. So I think those are a few points that I can just come up with off the top of my head. Thanks.
May I add? I am from the health sector. I work in the health sector for 20 years. And I think there is something that for me is quite important in Brazil. Since we started this digital technology process, is quite a process of getting more access to service, bringing services to remote areas. But sometimes we don't have the acknowledge of the feedback of the ones using the technology. So I have heard a lot of health professionals, healthcare workers and others, that they have a lot of saying about the technology, but there's no instrument for them to be listened in the process of a continuous development process. So I think you need to bring more than AI, but also some instruments to having feedback of the one using, and also capacity building in all the senses. During the pandemics, we have a lot of problems in education, connectivity, but not only that, is how this technology is brought to kids, to others, in the sense that it's a capacity building in all the ways through life of this part of the population. So it's one of my concerns is that this is an interactive process.
Thank you so much. And that brings me to a question from someone in the audience to someone else in the audience. Mark Chataway, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the importance of collaborating with the private sector, and if you have any examples of where that worked really well.
So I'm Mark Chatto. I work for a consulting company, and we have a lot of pharmaceutical clients, probably why the question came to me. There's a marvelous example in Egypt, although I'll tell you why I think it's probably not the one to replicate. So there's an amazing example of Gilead and the Egyptian government working together on hepatitis C. Egypt used to have, I'll stand to be corrected by an Egyptian expert, but used to have the highest prevalence of hepatitis C in the world. The Egyptian government agreed with Gilead that it would treat an enormous number of patients in a very short period of time. So it mobilized healthcare resources, the army, community workers. It treated 600,000 patients in 2 years. And Gilead agreed to transfer the technology to Egyptian companies to manufacture and to replicate that experience throughout Africa. It hasn't actually been replicated in that many places yet, but I know Egypt is working on it. So, I mean, I think that's a great example of something that we do in the current paradigm. But I think the need for private sector resources will be so high in the future that we have to think of a different paradigm, which is win-win. You know, we have to say that for-profit entities need to make a profit. And Luciana was speaking earlier. My colleagues in Brazil just did a big quantitative study of Brazilian businesses, and only 17% of them see an opportunity for themselves in the green transition. We need that number to be 80%, 90%. And so I think we have to start thinking about how do we help businesses make a profit, do well, and do good at the same time, and that has to be the paradigm for the future.
Just confirming what he said on the success of that campaign, we actually almost have 0 level hepatitis, which is incredible. I guess we got lucky. We're doing it all with the government and NGOs, and we haven't had any private sector involved. But definitely, if it is to be done at a larger scale in many countries, it will have to involve the private sector.
So we have 5 more minutes, so I think we can do 2 more questions, madam.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and I work for the Institute of Economic Affairs based in Kenya. So my question, I think, goes to Rachel. I think as we discuss multilateralism and alignment of global platforms, it's also useful for us to talk about accountability, particularly accountability of resources. We know, for instance, that Africa's annual development needs is almost equivalent to the amount of annual illicit financial flows from the continent. So here comes my question. How do you think, or what's the role of the international community when it comes to enhancing accountability mechanisms? What do you think should be done better to track and evaluate the impact of multilateral efforts when it comes particularly to advancing SDGs? Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So one of the points that I had made earlier, around the continuity in terms of getting an agenda on the table, ensuring that it stayed. The foundation, has had that opportunity to work with many governments, with different regional groupings, really trying to make sure that we have the connections. But in the work that we do, we also seek to be as transparent as we can. Many of you know that in terms of the investments that we make, they're posted publicly, they're on our website. We encourage many of our partners to publish the results of their work and make that available for others to build on. So I'm sharing this in terms of saying we are making efforts at least to be transparent about the role that we are playing. But in response to your question more broadly, I think this is a huge area that we need to come together and look at collectively. There are many times when we have large convenings, we will have commitments that are made, whether it's 100 million euros announced for X or Y. And how are we tracking as a global community how that commitment actually lands on the ground? and how it's utilized and the impact. Who then, we hear about the announcements, but we don't hear very often about the results on the same scale. So I think it's something, it's a good point, very good question, but there's a lot of work that I think still needs to be done about that. And with each of us as stakeholders, you know, at least doing what we can to start with in terms of communicating what we're doing and how we're using the resources that we have and the impact. Thanks.
We have 3 more minutes. One question. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nonyanka Chanza. I'm a struggling law student and I'm working in progress on a whole lot of other issues. I want to go back to the issue about the internet, because we all know that in order for us to achieve the SDGs, we do need to ensure that we preserve an open internet, but there are internet shutdowns by the global north. Actually, something that governments agree on. Exam, they shut it down. Elections, they just shut the internet down. Yet, when they are in the global platforms, everyone is embraced technology, digital technology, and all those things. Yet, these days, they just shut the internet whenever they feel like. So I feel this is an issue that we are not speaking about a lot. And I would like, it's not maybe really a question, but I would just love every one of us who sometimes find ourselves in these kind of spaces to keep on raising the issue, because we do need to develop the rules around internet access. Otherwise, talking about the SDGs really will not amount to much, because if you can't get on the internet, the economic cost for that, the human cost for that, they are massive. The reports are there. Access Now has done the research. We are talking here. Others can't really get on the internet and do the work. They can't even engage on the SDGs online because they don't have the internet, because someone protested somewhere and government was like, not today. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that final reflection on freedom of speech. I think we've come at time, so thank you so much, esteemed panelists, for your time, your wisdom, and your energy today. Thank you so much to our audience for jumping in and having this interactive discussion. Have a good afternoon.